This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, so before today, what I'm going to talk about is some ophthalmologic things, so things to do with the eyes. I've put a few lectures at the back, which you're not going to find it in the textbook. It's stuff that is more research-based and is a lot more current and what is what's going on now. And I put it in because that's something that I do, so it's something that I'm very interested in. But you're seeing stuff that's still happening in the research, not necessarily in the industry, but we hope to translate it into industry later. Okay, so yesterday I gave you a few announcements about the term paper. Because there is no lecture Friday week, which is the 27th because it's the grand final public holiday, I am going to condense the next 3 lectures on tissue engineering into 2. So this lecture next week will be a time, if you have any questions about your term paper, Peter and I will be here. There was a question asked yesterday in the lecture, and there's been a few emails going around about help with SolidWorks. We're trying to find another time slot to help, but because of how rooms are scheduled, when your workshops were held in weeks, 2 to 6, those same timetables aren't available for the rooms anymore, which then makes it hard to get a time when people who want help need help. That may not solve the answer regarding SolidWorks, but I'm more just letting you know that we're trying to find something, but hopefully if we do find something and there is another workshop held, it will get posted on LMS to let you know. Okay, so this time next Wednesday, any questions you have about your term paper, come with them here. Peter and I will be here to answer them for you. Okay? So today's lecture, we're going to go through implants, or not implants, biomaterials that are developed for things that come into contact with your eyes. So a quick little anatomy of the eye. I've put here particularly information about the cornea. Why the cornea? Contact lenses. That's the part of the eye that the material is going to come into contact with. So the cornea is this part at the front, but of the cornea, the cornea is then made up of 5 separate layers. So the first layer is the epithelium. Have you heard of epithelium before? Your skin's top layer is the epithelium. It's a quite common name. Epithelium is, I guess, the outer surface. It's just another word for it. So your cornea has an epithelial layer. It's about 5 to 6 cells thick. You then have the Bowman's layer, collagen. So that's one extracellular matrix protein that you find within the cornea of the eye. You have the stroma, which makes up the majority of the thickness. They have a keratinocyte cells in there, and they're the cells that make the extracellular matrix protein, collagen, and a few other ones as well. You have a type of membrane in there, and it's a form of basement membrane. So I would have referred to a basement membrane, was it yesterday in the cardiovascular? Was that yesterday's lecture? In the cardiovascular, how there's a basement membrane that keeps in the blood vessels 2 different layers of cells. You have that in your skin, you have it in other organs, you have it in the eye. And usually in the different tissue types, it has a different name. So it's just, this is the name that it is within the eye, but it's keeping different compartments of it separate. And then the final layer is the endothelium. So you've heard of endothelium before as well. So you have the endothelium which lines the inside of the blood vessels. You have an endothelium layer that lines the inside of the cornea. I've also put here what tears are made out of. Why do we need to know what tears are made out of? Or why does that come into effect? That is the solution that's in your eyes. And me reading up about tears, there's 3 types of tears, but your basal tears are kind of what they call just the liquid that, or the content is the liquid that's in your eyes at the moment. So you're not crying, but each time you blink and it's moving liquid across the cornea. So this is what is in the solution. It changes composition, always based on people, different states, different tear types. If you have someone who is crying, I think there might be a little bit more water in that, so things might be a bit more dilute. But what is in tears? Salts, water, different antibodies, lysosomes. So they're a type of enzyme that will chew up bacteria. So that also helps to stop eye infections as well. That's one of our body's mechanisms. I don't know why I have it in there, but there are then also different types of proteins that you'll find in there as well. They're in a lot of biological fluids, so you're going to get proteins in your tear solution as well. Proteins, biomaterials, it's usually something that we have to think about. So the main, I guess, eye contacting biomaterial I'm going to cover is contact lenses. There are a few other ones, and I've taken information from the textbook as usual, and I've taken information from different papers. Within this chapter of the textbook, it does go through different applications. You can read it if you're interested in, but it's the contact lenses that we're more interested in for this lecture and for the course. So I've got here hard versus soft materials. If you're if you're thinking about a material that you want to use as a contact lens, hard or soft? Soft. But back before people had developed hydrogels, soft materials, the first contact lenses were made of glass. I guess who wears contact lenses? Would you like to put some glass contact lenses in there? No. When I was reading up about it, I think it said he could last maybe half an hour before it was just so painful and irritating that you had to take it out. But back in the 1930s or before then, sometimes it's better than nothing. But, so after that, the next lot were made out of PMMA. Have I talked about PMMA before? PMMA, what's one of the, I guess, commercial names of it? That's with P? Perspex? So PMMA is Perspex. So from about the 1940s, a lot of them were made out of PMMA. And a lot of the times when I reference these materials, I don't usually tell you much more about the properties or much more about it than PMMA or what the polymer is. However, with a lot of these different polymers, depending on the properties of it, particularly molecular weight, can make a very, very big difference in how it behaves. So PMMA, if you're thinking of Perspex, it's very hard. You'd be able to change the length of the polymer of PMMA. I'm not saying it's going to be soft like the contact lenses that you would see today, but you would be able to make it softer than what you know as Perspex by changing material properties. So one thing I didn't mention go through when I talked about the anatomy of the eye, so your cornea is actually avascular. Avascular, no blood vessels. In our bodies, how do all our tissues and organs get nutrients? Via the vascular. It has to be vascularized. I think all tissue is around 200 microns from a form of blood vessel. That's how far oxygen can diffuse before there's a rate limiting step and it stops. So any tissue that's further than 200 microns away from a blood vessel will die or become necrotic. That relies on no other mechanism other than the blood to give oxygen. Our cornea is avascular, but while there are blood vessels in the eye, think about it, because your eye is open to the air. Can oxygen get through your cornea or get to your cornea in another way? So you can get air, oxygen from the environment will come in contact and start to diffuse through the layers. So it's not via the blood vessels, but it is via air. So if you are developing a material that's going to come into contact with your eye and essentially touch the surface of your cornea relies on oxygen coming to it from the outside. Do you think that you then need a material that has, or that is able to be gas permeable? So one of the big limitations with PMMA is it is not gas permeable. So because it's it is harder than a hydrogel material, you could create it so it will sit on the surface of the eye, and then you might get some of the liquid, your tears, that will fall behind the surface of it. So you'll get some gas transfer liquid that will fall behind the PMMA contact lens, but because it's no oxygen is coming through the material, there's only so long you could have had the PMMA hydrogels on, PMMA contact lenses on, before it gets too irritating. It was better than glass, but still not as good as they are today. So PMMA is a polymer. You can make copolymers, so adding different mixtures of polymers in different ratios together to change the properties. So PMMA was good for particular reasons, but then how do you add in gas permeability? You add in a different component. So, and I will go through some of them. There are particular types of polymers that are better at gas exchange. However, quite often they are hydrophobic. So also a hydrophobic material being put on your eye, which is covered in a tear solution that is aqueous, you're really not wanting to make a more hydrophobic material, you're wanting to keep it quite hydrophilic. So then they often will add methacrylic acid as the hydrophilic component to then counterbalance. You have something that is hydrophobic that allows gas exchange, but then you have another part of the copolymer which is more hydrophilic, so that it will still interact with the water. So the majority, not all, but the majority of contact lenses are now made from a material called, I call it polyhema, PHEMA. It's a nice material in terms of contact lenses. It's easy to manufacture. Who's heard of spin coating before? You get a polymer solution, you drop it onto a surface that's spinning really hard, and then you can get a nice uniform, really disc. So because this material was quite nice to spin coat, you're able to spin coat it, back when they first started making contact lenses out of this, that was one way they can manufacture it. Depending on what conditions you use, you can then make a repeatable polymer, same height, same thickness, as long as you use all the same variables, as long as you keep all the variables the same. So it was a nice material in terms of the ability to manufacture it, but then also it was good for, or it was favourable for contact lenses because it had stability within the right pH, temperature range, and osmolarity, so changing of salt under physiological conditions. So you don't want to change the pH, that's going to irritate your eye. You don't want to change the temperature either. You don't want to change osmolarity, and more, you don't want to change it. You don't want your materials to change if there's any fluctuation with this as well, or change those properties within your eye. So I've got here a list of some hydrogel contact lenses and their different properties. This is their trade name. I think you've kind of noticed a lot of the polymers that I've mentioned have a trade name, and then I tell you what compound it is, and you'll either know one or the other. So for contact lenses, trade name, take a note of some of these things. And I'll go through how they change and different properties and what influence or what effect they would have or can have on contact lenses. So high or water equilibrium content. These materials are all, I guess if I didn't say it, are hydrogels. You would have learned about hydrogels in the polymers? A little bit. Hydrogel, water gel. You have a particular percentage of polymer in the hydrogels. Their main thing is that they will suck up water. So it's got here water equilibrium water content. It will vary depending on how you change the polymer, which is why there is variability here. Then you have your oxygen permeability. So how well oxygen is able to go through the contact lens or the material. And then that's also going to change depending on different factors of the design. I've also put here the FDA group. So when I was looking at how FDA classes the contact lenses, they have 4 groups. So it's either low water or high water. So low water is less than 50%, high water is more than 50%. Then you've got non-ionic and ionic polymers. So one of the examples that I'm going to give you that I found in the literature compares protein absorption to these different groups in a way, whether or not it's an ionic one, a non-ionic one. Why is that? I guess ionic refers to charge. When we talked about how you can change different surfaces with polymers, it would affect interaction. Charge can affect water, charge can affect protein interaction as well. So I've kind of just explained the four different categories that contact lenses are referred to. In the page before, it told you what the gas permeability is. When I was reading about contact lenses and how different types of materials, everybody was referring to decay, and decay is a measure of gas permeability. And I forget what the unit is on the other page, but I'll explain what the units refer to. And it's whether it's a low gas permeability, medium or high, depending on what the decay number is. It can be low, medium, high, super high, or hyper high, but the ones that are in bold are usually the 3 that contact lenses fall into. I wasn't able to see the 2 high ones. It was pretty much the low, medium, or high. So that is gas, something that is a material property. So how well gas will permeate through it. So you guys have all done biotransport processes, learned about flux, that sort of thing. So here's where one of those, not mass transfer, but it's a transfer properties with materials can affect how these, or how they're also designed. So your decay, so the gas permeability will increase exponentially with the water content. So if you have something that's a high water content, the gas permeability will increase exponentially. So then that may come into effect, or that may affect which hydrogel material you choose based on what its water content is, if you want a particular gas permeability rate. So hydrogel materials have a hypothetical limit in oxygen permeability that approaches the oxygen permeability of pure water. So it's not going to... Your hydrogel is essentially made up of water, so that is your limiting effect. That is your limiting component variable in terms of gas permeability. So the gas permeability of your hydrogel material is not going to be any greater than what it is of water. I put the units here mainly because of my background. I'm a chemical engineer, and one of the first things I was taught in first year was units, units, units. So when I saw bara, I'm like, I don't know what sort of units it was. So it's more, if you're wondering how that converts to, because that's not an SI unit, it was more of interest. But pretty much everywhere that I looked at in terms of characterising hydrogel material for contact lenses, they refer to this unit here. So if you think by increasing the water content, you can increase the gas permeability, that's fantastic, yes. As always, something that is good for one thing usually has side effects, or not side effects, some downsides as well. So while high contact water hydrogels, you want it for increased oxygen permeability, they also have some disadvantages. Biofouling. So biofouling is fouling of proteins, particularly for contact lenses that are reusable, making sure they get cleaned properly. You don't want absorbed proteins to stay on there for a long period of time, so you want to reduce biofouling. If you have, by increasing the water content, if you increase the likelihood of biofouling, that's depending on what the contact lens, the use of it, if it's one-off, short-term, long-time, that's something to take into account. Dehydration. You may think it's a little bit counterintuitive. High water content increases dehydration, but it's the dehydration in your eye. You also don't want the water. You want to make sure that there's enough tear solution that it's coating your eye. You don't want that to come out of, or the hydrogel to suck up your tear solution. Particularly in places that have in air conditioning. So some people that wear contact lenses, they might find if they're in an air-conditioned room or air-conditioned environment for a long time, it starts to suck out moisture. If the hydrogel if the air is sucking out moisture from the contact lens, where is the moisture from the contact lens? Where is what will fill that void come from? It will come from your tear solution. So then that's how it can so you're more dehydrating the eye, which then leads to irritability. Your eyes will get irritated, so that's not something that you want.
Is that always from like the evolution example, is it always from loss from like the environment and then that transfer? What was the dehydration? Like, if you're not conditioning, but you're just losing some of the hydrogel moisture.
Well, there's going to be...
The dehydration is always coming from, because it kind of like needs to fill its closure of...
In a way, because the hydrogel can suck up or will contain a certain amount of water, yes. So I guess if you're in an environment that is very humid, you won't feel that dehydration. But it's, yeah, where is it getting that water content from? So I guess if you take your contact lenses out and putting it in a solution to wash it, it will get liquid from there. But if you're keeping it on your eyes and keeping it on for a long period of time, even just day to day, not day to day, if I don't wear contact lenses, what is, for someone who wears them on a daily basis, how long are you allowed to leave them in for? And it's okay. How long is not too long? So more than 12 hours? And it's these sorts of things that happen where just walking around, air conditioning outside, there's going to be some sort of evaporation. Yeah. Does that explain it?
Yeah. I just don't know if
It's going to depend on, obviously, the properties of the polymer and what the water content is as well. But it can probably lose a little bit before it starts taking it, but if it loses too much, yep, it'll just suck it from your eye. Then also, if you have a hydrogel that has a very high water content, if it has a high water content, and how you calculate water content is usually percentage. Percentage water, percentage polymer. More water, less polymer. Less polymer, it's usually quite a lot softer and can be harder to handle as well. So putting contact in, taking contact out, particularly if they're reusable, that sort of thing, you're wanting a material that while it is soft, is still in a way durable. It's not going to break, it will last, it will stay to its conformed shape. If you have too high water content, that is something that you will start to lose. So another thing about transfer of gases, and you would have learnt in biotransport processes, if you have the same material, the same oxygen, same water, if you want to increase oxygen permeability, you make the material you have, or the thickness, thinner, because there is less distance. Flux is always something over a distance. The less it has to travel, you shorten that distance, the more will get through over the same period of time. So this is just a representation of if you have a low water or a high water hydrogel and you have oxygen going through. If you have low, but then you make your contact lens material thinner, you have more oxygen going through, so that's one way. If you have high, then you make it thicker, more distance for the oxygen to go through, you're going to get less going through. And then it also goes across this way as well. If you have low, for the same thickness, same amount of oxygen is here, low H2O, not as much water. Increase H2O, get higher oxygen go through. Do you have a question?
How does this affect, some people think the contacts have, the shape of the contact is dependent on their level of the negativity of their vision in terms of some contact shape. How does this probably affect the people that have really severe eyesight and have really thick contacts? They're not, they can do, they can't reduce it anymore. Is that just reality of physics, so to speak?
I think you're then weighing up. So a lot of these contact ones, I guess, because I don't wear it, and I was more looking at the material properties, not necessarily the optics as well. But yes, that is going to come into account. If you're wearing them to be able to see, you're probably then having a material that is quite constrained in what you can actually change, and it probably is something you can't have on for very long. I have a friend that, she's very visual, she can't see without glasses, but when she puts in contact in, I know she doesn't wear them very often because it'll start to irritate her. So whether or not it's got to do with the oxygen permeability, because it just can't get through, you need it to be able to see. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So this is an example of looking at different hydrogel materials that are used for contact lenses, and if you change how you change the ratio of them changes the overall properties of the material, and then how that affects protein interaction with them. So you have your PMMA, you have your polyhema, and polyhema. Then you have copolymers, so polyhema and MMA and polyhema, MMA, and NVP. And this is just what each of the acronyms stand for. These table tells you the percentage of each one. So if you have 100% polymer, how much percentage is each of the different monomer components. So, because when I talked about when I showed you the FDA and there was the table, they were talking about high water contact, low water contact, the non-ionic and the ionic types of polymers as well. So this paper didn't really go into water content, but it talked about adding in ionic and non-ionic components. So just more about the properties. So the MMA, it's very hydrophilic, water likes it, and they have lots of groups in there that are negatively charged. So negatively charged is going to be an ionic component. Polyhema, moderately hydrophilic. The MVP is a highly hydrophilic, non-ionic polymer. And then if you're comparing the two different copolymers, I'll go from here. PMMA is quite, did I say it was hydrophilic or hydrophobic before? All I know is it is less hydrophilic than your polyhema. So, very hydrophilic, less hydrophilic than polyhema. And then in terms of charge, your polyhema with MMA is less negatively charged than the polyhema, MMA, and NVP. I've mentioned QCMD before. Does anybody remember me mentioning QCMD before? Quartz crystal microbalance. So this is a technique, and this is something that came out in around the 2000s, and it was the first piece of equipment that allowed people to measure things in nanogram amounts. And if you're interested in protein interactions, you're not really interested in milligrams that are absorbing onto the surface. Nanograms can have a very big biological effect. So this is a piece of equipment that can measure protein onto a surface on nanogram scale. So this is just comparing, and when I talked about QCMD before, it was comparing different proteins on electrode surfaces where they had looked at the cochlear fluid, the fluid inside the cochlea. This is now comparing different proteins that you would find in a tea solution. So the first graph is comparing different proteins. So your lysosomes, it's protein, but it's also types of enzyme. Albumin is another protein that you find in lots of different places, and we've talked about particularly with blood as well. And then your lactoferrin, which is another enzyme that you'll find in there. And the reason why they chose it was because it was one of the higher ones within tea. Depending on the material properties, you will then get different amounts. So ionic versus non-ionic, that will then affect the protein that goes on, depending if the protein has a whole lot of charge groups. If it's ionic because it's negatively charged proteins are then usually repelled, positive ones usually attract more. So by changing these small different components in your material, like with other examples that I've shown you, you can change how different proteins interact. And then the same is also with the HS gamma globulins. They're just a type of immunoglobulin you find in a lot of biological fluids. Cholesterol is a type of fat, a lipid that you may find in tea solutions. And then mucin. Mucin is a type of polymer that has, it's a biological material where it has polymer. I mean, it has a protein, but then it has the sugar chains that come off it. and these sugar tans are usually very negatively charged, which then affect how it interacts. But it's another example of what type of material you choose, how you change the different ratios can change the different material properties. High molecular weights, low molecular weights, ionic, non-ionic, hydrophobic, hydrophilic, affect different interactions with different proteins. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on, mainly because I have an interest in it, and hopefully, because there are a few subjects on neuro interface. I'm still learning the different subjects in the course, but bionics, that sort of, are there subjects within the course that you can take as an elective? Yeah, I think that's it. Well, and that sort of thing. So there is a lot of research, particularly at this university in Melbourne, about brain-machine interfaces, cochleas, bionic eyes, that sort of thing, where you're developing medical devices that need to continuously interact with the body. And it's the continual interaction that is needed for the device to succeed. But also have a think about a lot of these devices they're modulating the tissue using electrical pulses. Electrical pulses usually need something that's conductive. What metals are you, I think that was the answer. What materials are usually conductive? Metals, different types of metals. Depending on what metal it is, it's going to be more conductive than other ones. A lot of these tissues are soft, your brain, nerves. Developing medical devices where you're putting hard metals against soft tissues, it does the function that you want it, but in terms of looking at a material to tissue interaction, it's not really the best. And a lot of the things that I try and look at or have been reading in the literature is finding that the devices do what they want to do in terms of function, but at the same time you're getting a lot of host response and bad host response because of this. Just the mismatch between the material that you want to do in terms of function of the device and how to get the material to interact. So this is one example of a retinal prosthesis. Now, not all the retinal prostheses interact with the eye this way, but this is one example where they put, so the patient wears glasses, the glass has a camera, so it'll see picture. That picture is then, or the signal that it picks up is transmitted into an electrode, and the electrode sits on the back of the eye. So you have an electrode, which is this, the electrode array, sitting on the back of the eye. There was a paper that came out, I'll just bring all these up. Beginning of this year, where there was a number of patients who had been implanted with this device. So there was 33 devices that were given to 33 patients. Of those 33 patients, 20 of them made it up to a certain mark to be included in the trial of what they were looking at. They were seeing how the device was behaving or how it went over a period of time. And I think they went out to about 2 years. So in 50% of patients, they ended up with a fibrotic-like tissue that had formed either between the eye and the electrode or around where the electrode had been implanted. Some of these patients, it turned up straight away. There were some of them where it didn't turn up till after the 12-month mark. So that's the other thing. You have something implanted in your eye, you have an implant, and it's working fine for 12 months, and then all of a sudden, something we don't know why our body responds like this, all of a sudden it sees it as a foreign material and starts to, as our body does, attack it, forms a fibrous capsule, if you're having fibrosis within that part of the eye, depending on how severe it is, it can get worse, and it can then actually make the vision that you have already even worse than it was before. So there was the potential with these patients they were getting a prosthesis to help their vision, but because of the fibrosis that was forming, could actually end up with vision that was worse than they had before. So I know some of the other retinal implants, they're now looking at putting the electrode in other places away from the eye, and it's probably because a lot of this sort of stuff is happening. The other thing, pardon? No, that's not why.
Oh, no. I'm just trying to say it doesn't work in that thing, knowledge. And also, from what I've heard, from what I've seen is the last time, they kind of want to insert the implant inside the tissue layer as well. That's another strategy you can try, as opposed to within outer tissue layers.
This may actually be within those. It could be, and that's more, I don't do bionics, I do host response. So when I first saw these images, I just saw there is so much fibrotic tissue around it, it can't be a good thing. That was...
I think what I saw was the main reason why they don't want to have an external device is that the electrical signal.
Oh, yeah.
It takes a long time to stimulate.
Exactly. So it's one of those things, it's a toss-up, well, not toss-up, but you need to have the electrode so close to that tissue, because depending on what is the reason for the patient's blindness, you may need to have the electrode that close to the receptors to be able to stimulate them, and having it further away is then, well, there's no point, because the device doesn't then do what you want it to do. However, putting an electrode that close, depending on what it is, it then could, and it's these sorts of things where, particularly what fascinates me is we have all of this fantastic technology, but we still don't quite understand why our body does what it wants, but we need to understand both sides. But and these are things that you don't, there are companies that are working on it, but a lot of the companies are working with researchers in universities, because it's not all at a very fundamental level, but a lot of it is still in the R&D, which some stuff does happen in universities as compared to industry. So the other example is the cochlea. So the cochlea goes within this little part here. I didn't have a 3D structure of it, but it winds up in a way like a snail, a little bit coiled, and so the electrode goes within that area of the inner ear. This is bone, and then inside there's a fluid. So if you were to cut cross sections of it, which is what these histology images are, that image here, this image here, is you've taken like a little slice, and that hole that you see in the middle is where the electrode would have stuck. So this was a study that was done at the Bionics Institute, where they were having a look at how much, charged signal you can put through the electrode and what that happens to the surrounding tissue. So if it's unstimulated, I would say that in terms of a host response, you're not seeing very much. But then they increased the amount of stimulation that they were putting through the electrode. So this one was at 100, 267, 400. I am quite sure that this is the levels that they were stimulating it at were a lot higher than what a patient who has a cochlea has. However, these are in a way sorts of studies where you can do it at a high level, so it's kind of the extreme thing to see what would happen. And sometimes it doesn't always happen. If you have a small amount for a long period of time, for some things, can you do then a big amount for a small amount of time? So it's an overall sum. Does that make sense? Sometimes you can't really extrapolate to that sort of thing, but if you're wanting to see extremes of what's going on or what could happen, It's these types of, particularly when you're doing your safety and efficacy studies, you might take it to an extreme before you take it to what patients would see. But here, it's hard in here because it's H&E. In here you see bone and you see fibrous tissue as well. So bone is your quite dense bits here. And I would class all of this bit here as tissue that has formed in response to the stimulation. Probably it's a lot of collagen. Has it come from stromal cells? Has it come from immune cells? We don't know. But there is something that is going on when you stimulate at that level, or even at 100, you're getting some sort of fibrous capsule. Not fibrous capsule, but fibrous tissue response. So keeping on the theme of electrical stimulation, a lot of it, as I said, brain, neural tissue, soft tissue, you want, a lot of the electrodes will use platinum. Platinum is very good for electrical conductivity. Platinum, very hard. Put platinum on the brain, doesn't really, I guess if you're wanting a nice interface to occur between your electrode and the tissue, not very much. Hard metal, soft brain, also doesn't go very well. What are people doing to develop soft electrodes? So people are now also looking into conductive hydrogels. So I apologise for this image here. This was as nice as it was in the paper, so the resolution is a little bit hard to see, even for me, for some of the things, but I'll try and walk you through it. So this is, you have a hydrogel's nice and soft, can conform to different shapes as well. Similar properties or more comparable properties to soft tissue than metals. So in terms of a material property, a lot more favourable for a material that you would put in a brain interface. But typically hydrogels do not conduct. Can you then dope them with a particular material that does? And that's what people are doing. They're forming hydrogels. Hydrogel is a main component of, or the polymer is a big component, but then you're doping in 1 or 2% of these materials that are able to conduct. So you're then making a material that can conduct, and they are looking at these 4 electrodes, and they're able to stimulate tissues and cells with these. So this here was the graphic representation of the paper that they had, the graphic abstract for the paper. You've got your hydrogel backbone, so you can see that takes up the main component in there, but then you add in a conducting polymer, so then you see it all throughout. And then you have these ionic charge materials as well, which then also help electrical charge to go through the materials. These results here are showing charge capacity. So the black line up the top is platinum. So platinum is your control, the material that people use. How do then these different hydrogels compare? These dotted ones here are the ones in here. They're not as good as platinum, but they're not baseline. So they're improving. And I guess really, if you're comparing a hydrogel that is doped with a conductive material to a platinum electrode, it's going to take a lot of, I guess, for me, I would think it would be quite hard to get the same conductive properties of platinum in a hydrogel, but to be able to have some sort of conductivity in there is a vast improvement on the hydrogel. So they were able to add it by putting in heparin. I've talked about heparin before. Heparin, while it is an anticoagulant, it has a lot of sulfate groups which make it very negatively charged, which is why it is of interest in putting it in materials like this. So it's also an example of, it has one biological property and they're not using it in this for its anticoagulant activity. If you're able to covalently incorporate it in there, your heparin shouldn't come out. So it shouldn't act as an anticoagulant. These graphs here talk about impedance magnitude. Analysing that, it's not my area of expertise. I used to work in a lab where they used to conduct these experiments all the time, and they used to look at hysteresis, so you would change charge up and down and see how, hopefully I'm explaining it correctly, how the material behaves. You may know more about it than me, but it was looking at comparing how the hydrogel materials that were doped compared to the platinum as well. This graph here is then looking at the mechanical properties of the hydrogels. So platinum, it's a nice electrode, but in terms of its elastic modulus, it's very high. Looking at this here, cortex, so that's part of the brain. So if you're comparing the elastic modulus or mechanical property of things that you want next to each other and there's a big mismatch, they're not going to work very well. You can then look at the different hydrogels, depending on what they are. You're then getting them a little bit more comparable to the similar properties of the cortex, and depending on which one it was, had then so it was these two there that correspond to these two there. So they're not as comparable as these materials. However, the PVA HEP, that's not a conducting polymer, so that's just showing the baseline of the polymer. But then this component here, P dot, that's the conductive part, so that's the bit that they were doping. So by adding it in, you're slightly changing the mechanical properties, but you would have got an increase in conductivity. And they also then just show here that these materials, cells like to grow on them and they support neural growth as well. So you've got a material that is better for interacting with the tissue that you're wanting it to go up against, and then has able to conduct, or you can use it as an electrode, and cells also like to grow on it as well. So this group has done a little bit more with the conductive polymers. I'm pretty sure that it's not in industry, but they're working with industry as well. So it's just going to show you how we're developing new materials to be able to do, I guess, the things that we're developing for the medical devices in the future. Yep, that is the last one. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, so is it entirely new tech, or is repurposing previous technology like those contact lenses and stuff for new applications?
Well, no one has added, and how they dope it, but to create a conductive polymer, it grows as well. So no one has done that within a hydrogel before. Pardon? No one had made, polymers that can, not polymers, hydrogels that are able to be used as an electrode. Yes. They're also using PVA. So PVA is, I didn't see it on any lists for contact lenses. But there are so many different types of polymers that are used for hydrogels that it's interesting things.
So this time next week we're coming out projects for the LPA.
We're working on the SolidWorks or a computer one to help out with any questions. If we are able to make a time, it will go up on LMS. And then yes, this time next Wednesday, Peter and I will be here. If you have questions, come with them then.
When are we going to find out when we're doing the presentation?
I have to put together that and I will do it next week and I will let you know.